stay tuned.
Yeah, so we have about 98 bills that are moving in the state legislative space right now. About 9 have already passed first chamber, so moving really quickly. And we saw one just get signed this past week in the state of Washington. That was the first chatbot bill in 2026 to be signed.
Okay. Now, for the tracker, I think you're not overwhelming people with like 98 bills, right? You're giving people the ones that are actually moving or went through like one house, I think. Is that the plan?
Oops.
I'm sorry, folks. We are obviously having some technical snafu. Hopefully Justine will pop back. And maybe there was an issue with the delay. There's a little bit of a delay, I guess, so that if we, I don't know, talk about completely illegal things, LinkedIn can bleep it or bump it. But she is back. Let's add her to the stage.
Sorry, everyone. I lost my audio there, but I'm back. I'm ready.
All right. So we're not overwhelming people, though, in terms of the tracker with, like, you said 98, right? With all 98.
Yep.
You're because people are busy. They got to know what's actually moving. The tracker focuses on the bills that have passed one house. Is that how it's working?
Yeah,
Okay.
so there's so many bills. We're focused on the ones that passed at least first chamber, which shows that there is some genuine movement in the legislation this year, and at the very least represents the trends of what type of bills are making it far enough in the process to be relevant and perhaps even impact other states and what they're thinking of moving.
Now, for those of you who live and breathe this and need everything going on, you'll join FPF and our team updates extensively. But for sort of a high level piece that we've put out, which we think is going to be enormously useful, please check the site, and Adrian on our comms team has posted it here. All right, so let's talk about what we're talking about when we're chatting about chatbots. Simply typing into Gemini or ChatGPT maybe is covered, maybe isn't. Does it need to be a chatbot with a bit of a personality that's trying to, like, I used to have a replica AI friend until people thought I was so creepy because I'd be like, here's my little friend. But it was, very much having a relationship and trying to, Jules, you haven't talked to me this week, and how can I amuse you, and that sort of thing. Character AI, I guess, is, known in that space. Or customer service chatbots. How are they defining this category?
Yeah, so lawmakers are actually trying to get at 3 different types of chatbots, or 3 terms that they're using at least. So companion chatbots, which is kind of the character AI type of chatbot where you're really forming that emotional bonds. We've seen a lot of lawsuits that have emerged over the last year, unfortunately, with teens and youth that have had relationships with chatbots that have ended in self-harm incidents. A lot of those are geared towards that companion chatbot category. But lawmakers are also targeting chatbots broadly. So there are a lot of laws that just define chatbots as anything that is a generative AI platform that has interactive conversations with users. So things like customer service chatbots could get scoped into that. And then we also have lawmakers that are specifically focused on mental health chatbots. So those are chatbots that are geared specifically to have like therapy-like conversations with users. And there are specific protections that folks are looking at for those types of chatbots. That being said, just because a bill is scoped to deal with those companion chatbots does not mean that other chatbots do not fall into the scope of the law. So while there are carve-outs for things like customer service chatbots or even educational tools or internal type of chatbots that aren't maybe consumer-facing, there's a lot of times that those boundaries are not very clear. And as a result, I think we're going to see a lot of different chatbots fall into scope with some of the new laws that are being passed.
Yeah, I guess it can be hard to draw a line between, ChatGPT being sort of peppy and supportive, and also having, a memory and being able to reference previous things and this sort of thing. And then like, okay, it's now got a personality. I know we've been concerned about the educational chatbots, which, you can debate how effective or so on and so forth, but there are lots of schools and teachers and educational experts who really appreciate things like, Economy Go and other education tools that might respond with some nuance to different kids. If there's some kid who's just like, a wizard and getting everything right and gets like 99 out of 100 on a particular, test, the educational theory of how you respond to that kid versus a kid who got, 10% or 20% and is sort of striving, there's some nuance as to the right way to help support the emotional, the social, readiness to take on and go back and study again and so on and so forth. One of the challenges seems to be that the regulators are worried that if you start carving out different kinds of speech, now you start running into First Amendment restrictions that you're favoring one kind of speech or another. So sometimes they're being very wide to avoid legal nuance, but that ends up, I think, lumping the kinds of tools that maybe really aren't the issue and that have a lot of teacher or parental oversight with maybe some of the chatbots that they are concerned about. I think the federal proposals, in particular. Well, what are we seeing them demanding in their state legislative requirements? I know I've seen requirements to disclose that you're talking to a robot or talking to an algorithm, which fine, whatever. It seems like annoying, but maybe that'll puncture the fantasy for somebody who thinks they're dealing with a human. I don't know. I think anyone who's going down the rat hole of thinking that they're in love or like contemplating drastic actions because of some, interaction is unlikely to be deterred by some disclaimer, you're talking to a robot, right? What are the kinds of things that they're looking to see companies do?
Yeah, so last year in 2025, when we saw some of these laws being passed, it's exactly what you said, where the focus is really on disclosures and are you talking to a human? Are you not? We also had a focus on safety protocols. So the idea that if a user is expressing self-harm or suicidal ideation, that they would be directed to a crisis hotline. That was another really popular requirement last year. But this year, we're seeing lawmakers really take steps to introduce new different types of provisions that go a lot further than that, like disclosure, transparency based frameworks. So we're seeing a lot happening. For example, even with advertising, there are new bills that were introduced yesterday, even in California, that would put limits on the way that ads are able to be popped up in chatbots or the way that user data can be used for advertising. We have a lot happening with engagement optimization. So if you look again to some of those lawsuits that have happened in the past year, a lot of them surround the topic of chatbot design and the way that chatbots may or may not be designed to draw on users, especially minors, and keep them engaged in the platform. So a lot of the new laws this year are focused on prohibiting rewards at unpredictable intervals for users, or having certain conversations that, again, would draw in users and keep them on the platform. So we see some new provisions kind of in that space, which has been really interesting. We're also seeing a couple pop up that would specifically require age assurance or age verification, to be more precise, as well as parental controls that would allow parents to monitor the data, to monitor some of the interactions, even with some of the children's use of the chatbots. We also have, just important to point out, that a lot of the laws do have private right of actions associated with them, which is interesting. Some are AG enforcement, some are private right of action. The one that just got signed in Washington is a private right of action, as well as the one that was signed last year in California. So interesting to note that too.
So I guess we can start seeing the conflict perhaps with privacy, although maybe some of the bills that are intending to deal with advertising are intended to be protective. I've got to read the California one. I'm glad you flagged it. Talk more about the advertising piece in a moment, but clearly expecting companies to be sort of scanning the communications routinely to assess whether or not there's risk or harm, I think is really challenging, right? I mean, on one hand, we maybe want that in place when it comes to companies that are dealing with kids or so forth. But I don't know, do we want, my email which is a way I communicate, right, with all kinds of services and tools, being routinely scanned for whether I'm, saying something that could be of concern.
Mhm.
We see these mandates in schools, for instance, to kind of be monitoring, the network, and the experience with some of those tools isn't great. Now, maybe Gen AI has improved it since we last took a hard look at it, but when we looked at it a number of years ago, and other groups have looked at this, kid says, I'm going to kill him because, kids say stuff, or they talk trash. Next thing you know, they're being reported to the authorities, and are in some maybe government database as having made a threat, and maybe law enforcement. On the other hand, obviously we want to be thinking about the problems that we do have when kids are committing violence. Many years ago at AOL, we prided ourselves on the fact that users would report when they saw chats that they thought were somebody really evidencing possible self-harm, and we'd report it to the police. But boy, it was a hard decision reviewing some of those messages, because the cops are knocking on your door because of a reported suicide attempt. That's got a lot of ramifications. And are we human reviewers, even, let alone having AI do this, capable of having the full context of what's going on? Is this just somebody who's talking like this, or is this a real threat? So definitely need to have the right nuance here between being so intrusive that we want AI examining our motives and then reporting us to anywhere. I guess still an area where the science, I think, needs to develop before we can be super comfortable. Just a quick note on ads. Obviously, the OpenAI announcement that they were going to have advertising, and some of the pushback is motivating some of this. A lot of these services are super free and super expensive, and the notion that that is sustainable forever is sort of naive. So clearly, there is a place for an ad business model. I guess what people are concerned about is, it's one thing to have ads that target content you see on a page or sponsored links. What level of intrusion or intimate use of data or sharing of data? I mean, the ad tech ecosystem hasn't been the best at being able to guarantee that your data doesn't get spewed anywhere and everywhere. I'd like to think there's an opportunity here, if OpenAI or some of the others, instead of just adopting the current ad models that are quite leaky and where there's lots of concern, and where people don't really feel that ads are being personalized for them, right? They're being targeted. Ads are sold based on what inventory is available and what the advertiser thinks you fit into a relevant category they want to reach, right? Nobody is looking at me and saying, what am I most interested in and what would be most useful for me right now? When Netflix offers me, content based on the content I've been watching, I kind of get that it's useful and it's interesting, right? Can this be an opportunity for advertising in the age of AI to finally actually be personalized and useful in a way that users would find useful? I don't know, but I like to think that there's a path forward, and one that isn't as leaky where I have to worry about the data going anywhere and everywhere. Anyway, let's definitely take a look closely at the bill, because I think we'll have something to say about that. Okay, kids seem to be one of the big motivators. Can we touch base? I know you've been organizing discussions with various experts around the whole notion of kids accessing, or teens even accessing chatbots. Can you help frame what's going on there?
Yes. So that is the question that is at the center of all the chatbot discussions right now. The majority of these bills are focused around minors. There's very few that are including all of these robust protections for all users. It really is for the minors that are using chatbots. When it comes to accessing chatbots, there really aren't many proposals out there that would ban chatbots for minors. The one that I can think of is the Holly bill, actually, in the federal level, would set sort of a ban for chatbots, specifically companion chatbots for minors. But other than that, there's really just a focus on like content restrictions. So what can chatbots say or not say to minors? For example, sexually explicit content can't be said in the chatbot. There are some really interesting cases where they're limiting, proposals are trying to limit discussions around disordered eating or other topics that might have a lot more nuance to them, and that the chatbot may, for example, be giving you a meal plan that is flagged as being a flag for disordered eating. So there's a lot of nuance there, but we're seeing a lot of those content restrictions, and then a couple proposals that do include some explicit age verification, although that's not as common throughout all the proposals as of now.
Yeah, I think that would be concerning. I mean, the reality is this is what the world is using today to learn and teach and access, information for better or worse. And the notion that everybody would have to go through some, verification in order to use AI. I mean, that's what chatbots are. The way to use AI is, I think, a big privacy intrusion on everybody. And then if it's somehow going to be restricting, teens, or I believe they all, in theory, restrict kids at the moment, but if they're going to be restrictive just by their business practice, but if they're going to be restricting teens, then some are going to have access and some are not, right? Some are going to have a parent that signs them up and some are not. And then you end up really having sort of haves and have nots when it comes to this. So clearly, to the extent that we are going to be serving younger audiences, we need the companies building them in a way that is, has the oversight and is suitable. And then as we start talking about teens, having some nuance when you really know you're dealing with a teen. But I think throwing up, when we haven't yet figured out how to do age assurance well, especially for older teens, especially for services that are being accessed by everybody, definitely challenges. So there are a couple of bills that have become law in New York, California, the RAISE Act and SB 53, that cover foundation models generally. And when people probably in the general public are thinking about chatbots, kind of thinking about interacting with the foundation models, the Claude, Gemini, Copilot. What are the nuances between dealing with these general foundation model restrictions versus most companies who are not building foundation models, but are, doing some post-training that are building on top of these models? Who are we catching when these various bills are delineated?
Sure, yeah. If we're talking very specifically about the California and the New York laws that were signed last year, so SB 53 and the RAISE Act, I would say as of now, those bills are actually very narrowly scoped. It really is only capturing the most resource-intensive frontier model developers in those laws. I think, if I can pull up the definition even, it really relies on that 10 to the 26 flops categorization, which has been really popular, a little bit different in the EU AI Act. I think that's 10 to the 25th. So 10 to the 26 is even narrower, and really is narrowing down on those specific high compute level frontier models. I'll note for folks who are interested in chatbots and on this topic that there are some really interesting laws that are pending in the states, specifically still in Tennessee, that actually would use a lot of these definitions for frontier developers, but also apply them to child safety frameworks and to chatbots. So some really niche bills that kind of combine these two worlds together, which is really interesting. So what's different about these bills compared to the chatbot bills is a more like robust risk assessment framework or transparency framework that would just require developers to offer a lot of information about their different protocols and safety, et cetera, that maybe isn't required at this time in the chatbot laws. So if you are interested, folks are interested in that space, I would look again to some of those laws that are being proposed that combine that frontier model developer side of things with the chatbots.
So if I'm actually building a big model that requires a certain amount of compute, I get captured. But if I'm simply a developer using an API, or maybe I downloaded one of the open source models, and I'm doing some, post training for a smaller model, then maybe I'm not captured. I guess that's the way it goes.
Yeah, probably not captured. It really is trying to capture those who are training or initiating the training of the frontier model themselves. So a little bit different. It's really the developer and not the deployer as well. I'll point that out.
What else do we think people should know? Any other key provisions that we didn't mention that are in these bills? Or one thing we should mention is these are, I guess, the kinds of laws that Trump and the White House executive order are seeking to block or oppose, or the ideas for legislation that the White House put out that are being considered and drafted. They don't want to affect, however, the kids ones. So I guess kid chatbot stuff might be excluded. So kids can be protected at the state level. The politics for that seem clear. But the general chatbot bill, I mean, is that they seem to be focused on whether it's generally applicable. So the frontier model, let's talk about that, right?
Actually a really interesting case study when we're talking about the frontier model bills and what's happening in the federal level. As you noted, originally Trump the White House had some concerns about those bills and the way they're being produced in the state level. That being said, we have heard that SB 53 may emerge federally in the federal proposal this year. So the tunes may be kind of changing on that, and we might actually see that bill be codified on the federal level if that framework goes through. Which I think is a really interesting shift, and of course to be seen. As of now, Trump has just released their minimal proposal, their light framework, and that will be put into a much more substantial legislative proposal in the coming weeks or even month. But I do think there actually is a shift there in what folks are thinking around SB 53. And I can also speak to the chatbot side of things too, but a little bit different.
And to be clear, right, there is the Senator Marshall Blackburn, Trump AI bill, which is not the actual Trump.
It is not, yes.
Although she has lots of things in there that, Trump might like. But her bill is a very extensive, bigger regulatory package. The White House did not give us legislation, but presumably is working with Senator Cruz, who has previously been a champion of a broader light touch and subsequently talked about the different areas that might be exempted. So we may yet see somewhat soon a federal proposal. The politics probably still kind of complicated. Democrats seem pretty eager. Other Republicans, Marshall Blackburn and others, seem eager to be, regulated in the states. Governor DeSantis and others, on the Republican side as well as the Democratic side. Elections are coming up. The politics are clear that AI is perhaps becoming a political issue. There, people have views and have concerns.
It absolutely is becoming a political issue. Federally and on the state level, we see a lot of state elections in which folks are talking about AI. It's becoming more and more of a topic within politics. Again, to bring it back to chatbots, that as well, I think that there is a lot of bipartisan consensus around the need to regulate chatbots and to have regulations around youth and AI. When I look at the youth proposal or the state proposals for chatbots, it's almost 50-50 in terms of how many have been introduced by Republicans versus Democrats on the state level. And Blackburn, as you mentioned, has introduced that large AI package that has a very, very substantial chatbot bill in there called the GUARD Act that would set a lot of requirements, including age verification for companion chatbots and minors. But even the Trump proposal, while the White House proposal that has been put out, while that hasn't specifically gone into the nuances of what they plan to do around chatbots, I would imagine there would be something in there that would at least set some disclosure requirements or transparency requirements around chatbots. But that being said, yes, extremely political time for AI. It's very interesting to watch on the federal state level.
I'll be on a panel this week at IAPP about how to deal with deregulation, but I think the case that I will probably make based on this discussion and others is, what deregulation are you talking about? I mean, yes, obviously there is some drive, but obviously when it comes to the states or even at the federal level, it is a perhaps different framing for regulation, but it is certainly not a world where the legal and other risks are clear. Thank you for joining me. I hope we gave folks a little bit of a flavor of some of the action in this space. And Justine, thanks for the amazing work. And folks, check out her tracker at fpf.org and other work from her and the rest of the FPF team. Have a great weekend all. Justine, see you next week.
Bye. Thanks.